welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today, I am with Chris Krycho. I believe that's how you say your name. Actually, I forgot to
you got it right.
I felt like something here. I was like, that sounds right.
I said it a lot of times on the air, so you've heard it before. Or not all of your listeners necessarily, but some of you.
It's been probably burned into my head and unintentionally. You know, that experiment, like where people said that, you know, they put subliminal images onto TV and people went out and bought toasters or whatever that thing was.
Sounds about right.
In any case, he is the former host and creator of New Rustacean. Sorry, the name Rustacean is so used throughout the community, right?
Confirmed.
If you guys have been in Rust for a while, you probably have heard his podcast. And we were just discussing about how people miss it and wish it would come back. Maybe I'll let you answer these on your own so I don't put words into your mouth. But maybe just do a quick intro about yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah. So as you said, Chris Krycho, thanks for having me on. I've been glad to see the podcasting mantle continue to be carried by someone after I did the thing a few years ago. All the way back in 2015, shortly after Rust hit 1.0, I got very interested in the language and I decided I wanted to learn it. So I thought, what's the best way to learn a programming language? Well, it's to do a podcast about it, right? Spoilers. No, that's not a path I would recommend to anybody ever. It's a terrible idea for how to learn a programming language. Though I did learn Rust pretty well by doing it. It's a really hard way. It's kind of like pick the hardest setting you can think of for a video game. And that's doing a podcast as a way to learn a programming language. So I did the New Rustacean podcast from September, I think, of 2015 until about May, I want to say, of 2019. And over that period of time, covered the more or less the entirety of the language as it existed in that period of time. Now, people who've been around the Rust community for a while will recognize that some very important and interesting changes landed in the language in summer 2019. Namely, everything involving async await happened within about 2 months of me wrapping up the podcast, and it was all stabilizing right as I wrapped up. So I knew that as I finished that up, it would be things I left uncovered, but life changes happened. I wasn't in a spot where I could really continue devoting time to the podcast, and so I wrapped it up at that point. But up to that point, what I had done was do a podcast that taught Rust, and it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in terms of public speaking of some variety. It was also just a ton of fun. So I had that 3.5-year stretch where I was teaching myself all the little corners of Rust. And whenever I would get enough material together to have something to say, I would turn that into a podcast episode and put it out. And so that ranged from very introductory materials down to nitty gritty of how does the trait system work and how do all the new features work. So I did that. And around the time I was wrapping it up, I took a new job at LinkedIn. Prior to that, I'd been in a startup called Olo. And at LinkedIn, I actually got to write Rust for a bit. We built a little tool called Volta, which is a JavaScript toolchain manager. And I use it literally every day. And I never think about it because the promise of Rust for us succeeded. It is so fast that it intercepts and shims all your commands to make sure that you're getting the version of Yarn or NPM you want and the version of Node you want in any given package. And it's basically invisible. And so I spent about 6 months working on that in Rust. And I have not, for work purposes, touched Rust since then, other than little bits of maintenance here and there on Volta. So one of the reasons you haven't seen me around the Rust community as much for the last couple of years is just because it's not what my work has been focused on. And I don't have a podcast to keep me actively engaged anymore. But Volta was a great experience and continues to be. And we've got probably some more investment in that project lined up because the ecosystem has moved in the last 2.5 years, it turns out.
So you're still doing Rust, but more just so on Volta, is that correct?
Yeah, these days I use Rust in some funny ways. My day job involves writing a lot of JavaScript and TypeScript. So I'm an infrastructure lead for LinkedIn's flagship web application these days. And that means I write tools and work on framework level code and all of that for the ginormous JavaScript application that is LinkedIn.com. And there's no Rust in that application. And at least in the foreseeable future, I can't imagine us having Rust in the application itself. WebAssembly Rust stuff is awesome, but it's just not an appropriate fit for that app. However, I do a little bit of maintenance work here and there on Volta, mostly things like keeping the dependencies up to date and reviewing other people's pull requests when we land small features. The main thing I use Rust for, amusingly enough, is data mashing. When I need to go do something that involves basically writing a script. Some people would write Bash or Z Shell. Some people would write Python. I write Rust. I write all of my command line tools and little scripty things that I want to do in Rust because I am more productive with it than I am with any other programming language, including TypeScript, which is my day job language. And Rust is fast and it just works and it gets out of the way. And so anytime I need to do anything like that, I write a little quote unquote script in Rust and do cargo build and run it and do the thing. And of course, even debug builds are so much faster than dealing with a Node startup overhead or Python startup overhead or anything else for the kinds of small scripty type tasks I do.
Now, are you sharing these with other people, these programs that you're working on, or is it just for yourself?
Sometimes. Mostly it's been just for me, but there have been times when it was useful to hand to somebody else and I hand them a binary and they run it. And, I've got internal source code hosting for if it's internal tools or external. You'll find a handful of these, I think, on my GitHub profile where I just made something small. A little while back, I got sick of deleting node modules from my working directory when I had something where I needed to completely clear my cache. And I just created a tiny, stupid tool called buy, which literally all it does is take the folder you point it to and shove it into your temp directory. And then I can go kick off remove that directory later. But a move operation on any modern file system is basically a change of pointer. So it's instantaneous. And then I can run yarn or whatever in that directory and get myself a new checkout. And like I said, in some other terminal view or whatever, some other shell instance, go do an rm-rf to clean up that chunk of the temp directory. But it's just a funny little hack kind of thing that was easiest for me to do in Rust. People can do that with shell script. The person I got the idea from does it in a shell script, but I hate shell scripting and I love Rust. So I wrote it in Rust and you can go do cargo install. Like you can clone that and cargo install it. And it's not a very important tool. It's like a dozen lines of code, but that's the kind of thing I do with Rust most often these days because it's the thing I have the most use cases for these days.
Yeah, okay. That's interesting. I find it kind of strange that one of the most popular podcasts about Rust is in TypeScript land, but at least you're still doing Rust in some way.
Yeah.
There's no plans to try to change to a career that we actually could use Rust for your daily work.
That's a great question. The short answer is maybe. The longer version of that answer is, for me, Rust was always a side thing. In my previous job, I was writing a single page style app, JavaScript app, TypeScript eventually after we converted it. That's kind of my deepest area of expertise as a software engineer. I do, however, keep my eyes open for Rust and Rust opportunities. And one of the areas I think is most interesting to see that's very directly in my current career area and where I see some opportunities coming down the line. This isn't a LinkedIn is working on something statement. It's more just this is an area we all think is interesting and have our eyes on as a possible area to experiment in. Is modern JavaScript toolchain components being written in languages like Rust or Go? Those are the two big ones. So the major things you might have heard of in this space would be ESBuild and SWC, which is short for Speedy Web Compiler. ESBuild is written in Go, Speedy Web Compiler is written in Rust. Both of them are multiple orders of magnitude faster than the corresponding JavaScript tooling, which it just makes sense, right? They're languages that are compiled ahead of time, can make a lot more optimizations. Even as fast as V8 is, as fast as, therefore, the node runtime is. The fact of the matter is, Go and Rust can just be a lot faster. So, for example, down leveling all of your fancy new features code or stripping out all the types from your TypeScript to ship to a browser in a nice minified, down-leveled way to support older browsers can be way faster in a tool like ESBuild or SWC. And we're watching that space with interest, and we may at some point be contributing to it. We also I see that as a high-value space for us to think about innovating and building things in the future, where we may be in a spot to start replacing parts of our own build tool chains internally with those kinds of things. There's a lot of interest in that kind of thing. And in open source tooling that I work on across the JS ecosystem, there are chunks of that where Rust plus WebAssembly could be really, really powerful, where you could imagine shipping a WebAssembly precompiled bit as part of a Node package that can run in the browser or can run in Node, but also having precompiled binaries using the Neon project that your JavaScript toolchain could interact with, so that you could do some of that work in something like Rust. So that you could, for example, I work mostly on an Ember app. There are chunks of that where we would like to have a faster parser, because we actually do wait on parsing handlebars templates as used in Ember sometimes. And that ends up feeding into things like the language server that we use to get good feedback and type-powered completions. If we could get a Rust-powered version of that, that would be awesome. So there are a bunch of things where I want to use Rust potentially in the future, but I think most engineers learn after enough time doing it. It's about finding the right times to deploy it rather than just reaching for it because it's awesome. If we were reaching for it because it were awesome, I'd be rewriting the millions of lines of JavaScript code that make up LinkedIn.com in Rust. But that's a non-starter for business reasons, for culture reasons, etc. But where we can find those places where it's high leverage, high impact, high value, we're going to reach for it. And that was what Volta was. And it's the kind of thing that we'll watch for going forward as well. And in the meantime, all my colleagues just know that I love Rust. And anytime anything Rust comes up, they continue to link me to it. And that's kind of the space right now for me.
Yeah, I mean, there is, of course, a lot of people doing interesting stuff with Rust, even in the web side, right? Because I saw Amazon is using Rust with WebAssembly for their TV or something like that. I forgot. I think
It doesn't surprise me. I hadn't seen that, but it sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot what it is. I think there's the idea like, okay, let's build the stuff we know that probably won't change with Rust, but then there's like pieces of the UI will change, but we can still use Rust for that with WebAssembly. So they have like a WebAssembly runner that will run this stuff and something like that. I'm just trying to remember it, but anyways, they're doing interesting stuff, right?
And I think there's a lot of possibility in that space as WebAssembly matures. One of the challenges at the kind of place I'm working, any large tech company always has to be making trade-offs that can sometimes be surprising in smaller contexts, because one of the things we have to optimize for is what is going to work well for hundreds and hundreds of developers versus the way Amazon tends to structure its teams, sort of their 2 pizza box rule, gives you a lot more flexibility in some ways. It changes this kind of leverage you do or don't get as well. But you get the opportunity there to say, hey, we have a team consisting of a dozen people. We can make a unique choice here and run with it. When I have to support a couple hundred, I might need to make a different trade-off. And so our analysis so far has been that for our specific use case, one, we have a large mature app that works well. So we're not going to start rewriting it anytime soon. But even if we were looking to rewrite, the WebAssembly space is still relatively young and relatively experimental. Now, it's matured enormously in the last 2 years. The state of being able to write front-end web stuff in Rust today versus 2 or 3 years ago is leaps and bounds ahead. A lot of really interesting things happening there. And I certainly have my eyes on it for that reason, because as we get some of the key features in the WebAssembly space that allow for cheaper and more reliable interopt with the JS host environment, that allows you to do things in a way that can then defray some of the costs, because that's historically been one of the problems. You start handing memory structures back and forth across that boundary. And if you're doing serialization and deserialization, well, you probably just, unless you're doing some very expensive operation, you just ate up all the benefits you were getting from switching into WebAssembly mode by doing an FFI handoff. As we get things like weakrefs and other ways to speak across that module boundary, including especially the WebAssembly module definitions piece of the story, I think in general, the WebAssembly space will mature a lot, and it will become much more viable for any team to be writing any language that has a good WebAssembly backend, whether that's Rust or C# or Java or whatever the case may be, Go, you name it. We don't seem to have quite crossed that threshold yet, at least to me. I think we're getting there. And I think certainly within the next 3 to 5 years, you'll see a really significant transition point where that becomes much more viable. And I certainly hope so, because it remains one of the things I'm most excited about in the entire Rust space.
Yeah, so you guys actually ever start to evaluate things like you? Because you are working in that space, right? I guess you must be taking a look at that, right?
Yeah. No, I've been watching you for the last few years, and I really like a lot of the pieces about it. Also, Seed. And there are a couple others I've taken a look at. Some experiments that ended up not being maintained over time. And you is something I really like because I find the Elm architecture from which it borrows heavily to be a great pattern overall. And in fact, I often, sometimes explicitly, but nearly always implicitly, when I'm trying to help people reason through how to deal with some complicated state flow and management problem in a big single page app, I'm basically reasoning in terms of the Elm architecture and things which implement it, whether that's you, whether that's F#'s Fable, whatever the case may be, is a great pattern. It's not something we're going to rewrite our millions of lines of code into anytime soon, but it's a great pattern and it's one I'm watching. And I think there's a lot of potential in that space and with that design pattern. I also think there's some interesting things that I've seen happen in the broader web community that I think are really good opportunities for Rust, both because of Rust's first-class macro system and because of the compiler in general, which is, if you look at something like Solid.js, which is using a React-style syntax, or if you look at Svelte.js, which is using its own custom syntax, or if you look at what we're doing in the Ember world with Glimmer, all of these are basically an approach that says we're going to use compilation as a way to drive our understanding of what needs to happen reactively. And this is different from the virtual DOM model, which React and Elm and lots of other things have used. VDOM is very effective in a lot of ways, but you can do much better than what a VDOM will give you maximally for performance by treating your templating layer as a compilation source and compiling output from it. So Solid.js does this in a really interesting way. Glimmer and Svelte both do this in interesting ways. And I think there's an interesting place where web Rust technologies could do the same thing with their templating layers of basically optimizing the template input, not into a VDOM, which is what U does last I checked, but into one of these precompiled formats. And by doing that work, you can say things like, I can statically see that this particular node will never change. Or I can see that that node is going to be dynamic, but it's going to be something that I can do an incremental computation and update to, along the same lines as Salsa does for the Rust Analyzer, and ultimately getting integrated into the Rust compilation toolchain as well. As you hear me say those things, I realize, so I don't write a lot of Rust, but I very much keep up with Rust. So I'm 100% not up to date on all the RFCs because, oh my goodness, the RFC traffic on Rust is very high. But community blog posts, skimming through things on Reddit occasionally, watching Rust, Twitter, etc. The recent very interesting discussions around handling unsafe pointers and dealing with pointer provenance, etc. I like Rust. I may not be writing it for my day job, and my day job's a good fit, but I'm up on it and watching it closely because someday maybe again.
But are you a listener to this podcast?
Occasionally. My listening to podcasts in general has dropped off over the last few years. So when I do occasionally listen to this one. And there are about 3 other podcasts total I listen to, and almost none of them are programming podcasts these days. Life is funny like that.
I mean, it's good to hear that at least you're listening to this one. So, or else I'd be a little bit sad. But was it like 3, right? So 1 out of 3 or something like that. This seems not bad.
Yeah, and this one's occasional. I only have 2 that I listen to. There's probably a half dozen podcasts that I listen to on an occasional basis. And this one sits in that bucket. And then there's about 2 that make my regular bucket. So it's a short list.
So, I mean, obviously, work keeps you busy, personal life keeps you busy, but I think you did a couple different podcasts, if I remember correctly. You did quite a bit of stuff. So
yeah.
Did you drop all podcasts for the time being, or is there some you're still going on?
No, at present, I'm not doing any. I wrapped up Rustacean May 2019. My wife and I had an occasional podcast about the Mass Effect video game, which was really fun. But as our kids have gotten older and gone to bed later and later, our time in the evening where we might do something like play a video game and then have time to record a podcast episode, even a short one afterward, it just disappeared. And I also had a podcast called Winning Slowly about technology, religion, ethics, and art, which I always like to joke was my excuse, was basically us just saying we could talk about whatever you wanted. Because if you think about the stretch of things covered by technology, religion, ethics, and art, that's everything that humans do, more or less. It's basically all the pieces of culture. We wrapped that one up after 2020, more or less. We put out a wrapping. No, we're actually done now episode late this last year. But both my co-host and I on that one had just hit points in our professional lives and our personal lives where we were just too busy to put the mental time into it every week. In his case, he was tracking toward and is tracking toward being a tenured professor somewhere. I have been working through some pretty large projects at work, which just took a lot of mental time and energy. And then both of us have kids who are getting older. And it turns out that spending time with kids absolutely trumps podcasting. Like, I like podcasting. We'll probably pick it back up at some point because it's a really lovely medium, but hasn't been the one-offs like this I enjoy doing. And I get to do this currently once or twice a year, usually with folks. But more than that, well, not something I can commit to at present.
So if you do come back to podcasting, let's say the kids finally move out, is it back up one of the previous ones, or are you going to be doing something different? It's hard to say, I guess.
It is in that hard to say bucket. I really have no idea. I've thought about doing a much more general software podcast. I've felt a gap for a long time in sort of the mid-level software development and engineering discussion. There's a lot of relatively introductory material kinds of things floating around. There's a lot of kind of conference talk material for what most conferences are looking for, kinds of things floating around on podcasts. But one thing I don't see a lot of is really serious deep dives on hard subjects, in part because it usually just takes a lot of time. And speaking from the years I did New Rustacean, even prepping for something where I'm just trying to introduce a programming language, those prep sessions were, I could spend a week worth of time, like a work week, 40 plus hours sometimes prepping for those, between all the reading, building code exercises, actually scripting the episode, etc. And that wasn't necessarily the norm. Most episodes I could pull off in 10, 12 hours. But when I was writing the 3-part traits deep dive series, I have no idea how many hours I took to get that just right, because it's really hard. So doing the same kind of thing for deep dive on hard software engineering discussions, it would take a lot of time to do it. If somebody out there is making that podcast, you should tell me about it and I will listen to it. But the closest I've heard is stuff, sometimes the software engineering radio could get there. Co-recursive gets into more of those kinds of things at times, but that space is mostly underserved. So that would be a place I would think about going. Beyond that, I have ongoing interests in ethics and theology and culture that I could see picking up. And heck, I could maybe someday go back and pick up Mass Effect and play and do that one with my wife. That's the kind of thing I could totally see doing, but nothing I can imagine committing to it at present. And it's going to be a long time before the kids are out of the house. So we'll see.
I am kind of curious about, I think people don't understand the amount of preparation that you did. I mean, I know because I'm doing this stuff now, right? Mm-hmm. And I can imagine that I think when you record, it's like a super tiny slice compared to all the other stuff you have to do, right? So maybe we can talk a little bit about the background of the podcast, about like why, or not why, but what's actually involved, right? So maybe you can talk about what is your working style about how you do the podcast episode.
Yeah. So the way I would prep obviously varied. If I was doing a news episode, that was relatively straightforward. I would just kind of try to pull through things like This Week in Rust and recent blog posts, recent RFCs I saw merged, things I was seeing stabilized, and talk through those. And that was mostly a matter of just pulling together the relevant information and then trying to write a script. And I did, for almost the whole time I did the podcast, I did script it end to end. And I wasn't necessarily reading the script exactly. I had the script up in front of me, but a lot of times I would be kind of riffing on the actual thing I had written down. The teaching episodes, though, are the interesting bits. And if you want a long discussion of this, I did a dedicated episode on it because I figured people would care. And so that one's back there in the archives. But the summary is, the way I would look at it is, what's next to teach? What have I covered so far? And what makes sense next? And sometimes I would look at things like, where does the book go after covering some of this, the Rust programming language? But more often it was just as an intuitive sense of, what flows next? What fits next? What have I covered? And what needs to be covered next? How can I build on the things I've layered down? And so over the course of the podcast, I started with early stuff. Let's talk the basic programming model, and then worked my way up to things like traits, things like FFI, things along those lines, which really are important parts of working with Rust, and especially the trait system. But they also require a fair bit of, hey, I just need to know the basics first. So when I would go to sit down to prep those episodes, I would then build out a list of, what are the things I want to cover? What are the things I need to say from a conceptual standpoint to convey this material? What is it that I need someone to understand about the trait system? And the reason that the traits deep dive ended up being, I think, 3 parts long is because that was a very long list of things, because traits are the fundamental compositional primitive in Rust. Surprise, it takes a while to cover all of the things that get involved in that. And then I would start building out code samples and scripting it. And that was kind of a back and forth process where I would start scripting and I would realize, okay, I need an example to flesh this out. And I would go build a code sample. Building a code sample is a very fine art for teaching materials in general. It is particularly a fine art when you're going to be saying the code sample somehow or another on a podcast, because trying to figure out over time, how do I say, do I say FN space foo open parens first paren, on down the line? You have to develop sort of a way of talking about it, saying, okay, the function foo, which takes self as a parameter and it's owned, and then it takes a reference to a string as its second parameter, name, and then U8 as its third parameter, and that's an age. And then it's going to return a string and see if, I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I'd been thinking through that and thinking, oh, this is actually a reference to a string slice if I was going to take a name, because idiomatically in Rust, you would take a reference to a string slice, not take a string by name. And then I'm going to return a description. Name is age. And so then I would need to think through, okay, how do I say format macro, format exclamation point, and all of those kinds of things. So try to keep the syntax load for any given code sample minimal, because people just get lost. Like, I'm sure, dear listeners out there, that trying to keep up with that as I was just saying it, it's hard. So I would try to keep the code samples minimal. I would try to write them in such a way that I could say, okay, that thing we said before, now I've introduced this new element to it. So the same function definition, and now here's the format with args or something like that. While in the actual body of the episode script, which I would post on the website, I would have the fully expanded form of that. So I didn't have to repeat myself over and over. That would also get laborious. And then I would do the script end to end. And I know roughly how quickly I speak. So I knew roughly what my target count was, aiming for that 15 to 20 minute sweet spot, which I picked because there's pretty good research on human psychology, which says you can sustain attention on learning something for at most around 25 minutes. After that, you just lose focus and you lose your ability to concentrate well. So good professors in college will, recognizing that, incorporate kind of little mental letdowns, which give you a chance to reset. Sometimes it's pausing to talk about questions. Sometimes it's having a discussion or whatever else, but it lets your brain shift modes and you're no longer trying to do focused content absorption. So I went for the 15 to 20 minutes range for that reason, because it's well within that window. And I'm asking a lot of you. When I'm asking you to process via audio this syntax, well, people who are blind or otherwise have visual impairments might be used to that from their screen readers, but the vast majority of us are not used to processing code in an audio form. So keep it in that range, do the word count, trim it down if I have to, or if this is getting too long, break it into multiple parts and then introduce transition material and figure out how to say, okay, here's enough for today. Here's what we'll pick up with when I come back to this in the next episode. Then record it. And people have often commented on the quality of those episodes over the years. Some of that was investing in good audio equipment. A lot of it was taking the time to do the editing. And taking time to do editing means when you make a mistake, you don't just keep going. You stop and you find a point previously that you can go back to and say again. And so one of the fun little skills you learn as a podcaster, I think, is keeping a little audio log in your head playing of what you've just said so that you know, oh, here's the point where I started and then had a bit of a pause that I can pick back up in. So I can go back to there and I don't have to go back 2 paragraphs in my script to keep going. I can just pick up from where I was a half a sentence ago and keep going. Then, after recording the whole thing, which spoilers normally took more than those 20 minutes because you make mistakes, you figure out you said something wrong, dump it all out, pull it into, in my case, I used a mix of Logic Pro on Mac and Ferrite on iPad, and edit it down. Try to cut out mistakes, try to cut out long pauses, try to cut out other places where I ran out of ability to keep speaking without taking a drink, and so paused for 30 seconds and reset. Cut out the silly things I said, sometimes stick them in a blooper section at the end. And then, ultimately, after taking all of that, then publish it. So for your average teaching episode, that was 10 to 12 hours of work, all told. For a deep dive on traits, like I said, I think the 3 episodes together took me 40, 50, 60 hours. It was a lot. Most of them weren't that bad, but that one stuck in my mind because it was a lot.
It was a nightmare, it sounds like.
You know, the funny thing is I loved it. I really enjoyed it. And I like writing. I like teaching. So those parts were great. And I actually really enjoy editing podcast episodes. So that's a weird side hobby and interest, but I actually really, really enjoyed it. And there's something really satisfying in the craft of delivering something that is really tight and really well polished. It's a lot of work. And frankly, it's more work than most people should do. The conversational podcasts I did, we didn't put in nearly that much time. Like even counting both hosts' time, it was probably 4 or 5 person hours for a 40-minute podcast, including prep, including recording, including doing the editing and publishing. Much more manageable. And I still edited that way more than most people do. But I like podcast editing, so I didn't mind.
Yeah, so podcast editing, I mean, I'm lucky enough that I'm able to actually outsource that. So I have an employee I pay full time to do that podcast editing. And then we recently started bringing on an outside person to also do it too, because, you know, we're still a business. And so, yeah, I mean, this is just funded by the business itself. And so, yeah, it is nice to be able to kind of free up that resource in case I need him for something else.
Totally.
But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work. I know that because I've seen him like, he obsesses about this stuff. He's like, you don't hear that like CPU fan going off. I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't even.
It's like the worst. Yeah.
Well, I'm like, I don't even hear like a mouse fart. I don't know what you're talking about, man. I don't know what's with your ears.
No,
He's like, what's wrong with you?
I'm with him. Yeah, I actually ended up purchasing some of the industry standard audio processing software to clean up things because, you know, when I was doing this, we didn't have the incredibly ridiculously quiet M1 based machines that I'm using at home now. And I also have a heater that runs sometimes. And whether it was the heater or whether it was the fan on my Mac spinning up, either way, I could hear that on the recording and I would denoise it. And, you know, I tuned over the years my exact denoising profile. It's audio nerdery. I make no apologies for my audio nerdery.
I mean, that's fine. Like you said, people really remark about that. So, I mean, I can't say that what you put in is relational, but, you know, I think there's a point where it's like, there's too much. And I don't know if you did too much or not. Maybe you did, but in any case, I think it paid off. And I don't think you ever regret it.
No.
I think your own obsession.
Right. Yeah, it was not a case of I felt like I had to do those things. Obviously, lots of podcasts don't, and it's fine. But for my part, I was enjoying the result of it. Like I said, there's a deep satisfaction that comes out of really mastering a craft and doing it really to the maximum of what you can pull off. And that was what it was for me. And so it was a hobby in that sense. And like any hobby, there's a joy in that craft.
Yeah. For me, I'm more concerned about the microphone quality and then, you know, let the editor handle all that because it could take you forever if it depends on how,
it really could. Sometimes it did.
But I mean, the prepping alone for any episode does take time, right? Luckily, if we're doing these kinds of interview episodes, I think overall there's less prep. And I mean,
Yeah.
you can go into them blind, but I try to do at least a little bit. And somebody like you, I already have an idea about where what you were doing, the kind of the main topic. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I also kind of want to be surprised, right? And I don't think I can find everything. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if I find out, what you had for lunch yesterday, I think that'd be a little bit freaky, right?
That'd be a little creepy.
I need to have a little bit of a limit about how much I know and also how much you want to reveal too, because you have your own privacy.
Yep.
You're not the beck and call about we need to know what is Chris doing at these days, right? But just know that of course, that you're missed. That the episodes are missed, and I understand as somebody who does output podcasts that they take a lot of effort, and so you need to consider, hey, I love the feedback from people. I love doing these things, but I only have so much resource of myself, time, effort, all this kind of stuff. How can you figure it out?
That's exactly right.
And I don't think you're in a stage where you're like, I didn't enjoy it. It's like, I'm sure you struggled a bit, at least, just a little bit, at least, to say, I really want to continue, but.
Yeah, no, it was a hard decision. It was clearly the right call. It was the kind of thing I spent time talking with my wife about it and thinking hard about it. And it was the right call, but it was also a difficult call. It was, in a very significant way, it changed the whole trajectory of my career in a real way, where I'm at LinkedIn now and the kind of role I have now and the kinds of things I've been able to do were impacted by doing that, and the ability I have to continue to make changes and influence things. It also really inculcated for me a desire to keep, in different ways over time, of course, but to keep finding things that matter like that to invest in. And the shape that takes over the course of the rest of my career, I don't know what it'll be, but having been able to be a part of Rust's story in a meaningful way, having a chance for thousands and thousands of people to be a significant part of how they learned Rust is really cool. And it's really neat to be able to look back. It was a really crucial time for Rust's life. It's a curious thing, but I do believe that having a podcast that does a good job, and that can be a lot of different ways and shapes, but having a good podcast or number of podcasts that does a good job of helping foster interest in and helping build some of the community around a piece of technology can be really important for getting it off the ground. I think Elixir had a lot of success in part because there was a good Elixir podcast early on. I hope and I do believe that New Rustacean was a meaningful contributor here. And I've seen the same with other languages as well. I've seen the same with other frameworks. I think there are many, many things to which I would attribute React's success in the front end web space, but it had a number of good podcasts that really framed the conversation around it, and a number of non-React specific podcasts that it was a regular and recurring topic that helped frame it. So I think those kinds of things are ways that, somebody's little side project can end up being a really important contribution to how language or framework or other kinds of ecosystems and communities can develop. And getting to be whatever small part of that I was, I don't think it was a large part. There were a lot of other people whose work was much more important than mine in that. But it's nice to have been a very small part of it and not a zero part of it. And so I do look now for ways that I can have impact that goes beyond whatever the current day job is. And I think often about my work at LinkedIn as being a thing where I'm always looking for, where is that leverage point that what I'm doing benefits LinkedIn, like what my broader interests are benefit LinkedIn. And also at the same time, I have leverage to achieve goals that aren't just for LinkedIn. And that's a fine line to walk. Like at the end of the day, LinkedIn pays my bills and I want to prioritize LinkedIn. But I also think these things tend to be, when done right, they're positive sum. They're not zero sum games. And so finding ways that by moving LinkedIn forward, I and the folks I work with, we can move the industry forward as well. Those are huge wins. And I learned that in a lot of ways by doing a podcast for 3.5 years and realizing that, actually sometimes the right person at the right time, and right in this case, just meaning I showed up and did the work, can make a really big difference, can actually have a significant impact on the shape of certain little parts of our world. And that's really cool. And I would actually offer that an encouragement to folks out there listening. I was not a Rust expert when I started. I started because I wasn't a Rust expert, in fact. And I got to have an impact not by being someone who already had it all sorted or by being someone who had all the right things to say already, but by just buckling down and doing the work and sharing what I was learning with people. And I gave a talk at Rust Belt Rust back in 2017 called Becoming a Contributor. And one of my theses then that I still maintain now is that contribution to a programming language community, to a framework, to whatever the case may be that you're interested in building, can take a lot of different shapes. Writing docs, doing podcasts, building compilers, anything in the range in between can be really, really valuable. And so not to be turned off by the fact that you don't have compiler expertise. I'll tell you all a secret. I still have no compiler expertise. I would like to hopefully do something that involves parsing someday. That sounds like a fun thing to learn, but I just haven't gotten to do it yet. And so you can have an impact without being someone who's on the Lang team or the compilers team. You can just show up in the area you're in and make a difference. And it may not be huge. New Rustacean was not a huge splash in the world. The people who knew it and loved it, I appreciate. It was small. Compared to the number of people who will ever use Rust, it's probably, some 1/100% or something like that. But it made a difference at the right time. And so I'm really proud of it. And I'm glad I had the opportunity when I did.
I have a couple of things I wanted to kind of interject with. One is that you and I share the same thing. The reason I wanted to get into this is because I am still a beginner within Rust, and I thought this is a great thing to push myself into it. The other thing, too, is that you did mention something about an Elixir podcast, because, that's one of my languages. Which one is this that you're talking about?
It has been, as I said, my podcast listening has dropped off. It has been a few years, but this is the part where I search the internet on, I don't know, where'd it go? I don't see it.
Okay. The reason I ask is because I'm actually on one of them, so it'd be interesting to hear that. But I think at that time, I think it must have been somebody else that was doing it because I'm a recent panelist within the last half year or so.
Gotcha.
I'm guessing it must be years ago.
Yeah, no, that was what I'm thinking of was kind of the mid 2000s when it was first really catching on in a lot of places.
Okay.
But yeah, I have nothing more to say on that sentence. I just realized I'll stop.
Yeah, it's fine. No, but I was a little bit bummed when you're like, oh, that idea is bad. I'm like, oh, that's why I'm doing this. Now it's like, maybe I should stop and reevaluate myself in my life goals now.
Which thing did I say was bad that made you think?
Kind of trying to learn Rust through podcasting.
Oh, yeah.
And through actually producing podcast episodes.
I mean, if you're one of the people who has the fortitude to stick it out, then I will say props to you. But I don't recommend it as a general thing because, as you have no doubt discovered, it's really hard. If you have the gumption to go after it, props. I don't think it's bad. I just think it's hard. And hard things can be good.
Yeah, I guess it kind of depends on how you want to be. It's how you actually want to learn it, right? So for me, I'm not focusing on the syntax. I'm not focusing on the libraries. I'm focusing on more higher levels. Like, okay, we have what are the async runtimes and how do they work and why are they separate? Or not why they're separate, what makes them different? What is this team doing, the library team? What's their responsibilities?
Yep.
So the way I look at it is, I'm not learning the syntax. I'm learning the nitty gritty. I'm learning like higher levels and getting this kind of stuff. And I think learning anything is better than, just saying, okay, I'll get to Rust someday. That's the way I kind of look at it too. And so producing this is, I mean, I'll just be direct, right? And say, this is also a marketing channel for me to kind of get myself out there. My company, we're getting into Rust and I don't want to hide that. I don't want to make it seem like a hidden thing. It's, that's one way to look at it. The other thing too is I want to also contribute, right? I can't contribute a code at this point because one, I don't feel like I'm able to. Two is I just don't have the time to do it.
Totally.
And so with those two alone, like I think I have experience with podcasting. I'm on a couple other podcasts. So I think that this is probably the easiest one. And I think that this is also a way of connecting people, right? Because people don't know what is you. Now they do because I did an episode.
Right.
All kinds of stuff. I'm bringing I'm connecting people. In fact, I just made a couple of connections last couple of weeks. Some guy said, hey, I really want to know these people. Can you introduce me?
That's
and
awesome.
I did that, right? Yeah. And I'm making connections, right? Not trying to gloat, but I mean, like I'm
No, it's super cool that you get the opportunity. Right? Yeah. No, I think that's really good.
I just want to say I would never guess that I would have this opportunity to talk with you. Like that's also a benefit, right? I have to also be direct and say, hey, listen, there's a lot of benefits for me too. Like I get to talk with Chris for a moment.
Yeah. No, I had the same when I was doing it and it's really delightful. And it's I mean, I think the approach you're taking with learning and learning the higher level pieces of it, honestly, is way more friendly to podcasting. And it's also really, really valuable. I really enjoyed when I did the show doing the crates you should know episodes because they were more along that line of like, here's a chunk of the ecosystem you should know about. And today I would probably be looking at async runtimes. And so I'm really glad to hear that that's a thing you're doing because I think it's really valuable and it does help people who are learning get a sense of the space, get a sense of, okay, I've learned the language, but now how do I put it into practice? And it's one thing to have a language, but so much of what makes a language successful or not is the ecosystem around it and being able to talk to the people, being able to talk about the different crates, the different approaches, and why they might differ. That's enormously valuable. So props.
Well, I think the biggest issue too is like, let's just take the issues of GUI, right? Which GUI should I
Mm-hmm.
use? Each one's got
Mm-hmm.
pluses, minuses. So I've been doing my best to try to get each and every significantly used GUI maintainer on here because for me, like I'm always attracted to GUIs. Like people want something that looks nice and they can use it, or just usable, right?
Yep.
Like the first time, like the only thing I wanted to work on when I got into computer programming was making a nice GUI.
Yep.
Didn't happen until I graduated and was like 6 years out or whatever, where I could actually make a native GUI app, right?
Yep.
It's just the way it was. Otherwise, I'm doing all command line stuff since my university days. It's like,
yep. I mean, I think that's a huge part of what attracts people to web, right? Is that you get that immediate feedback of being able to put something on the screen that people can interact with. And it's really powerful. And yeah, I'll have to go look at those specific episodes because I've been watching that space with interest for years now, back from when Rafe Levine kicked off the XiEditor project. There's a lot of maturation that's happened. It's still very young, clearly, in a lot of ways. And it's a hard space because you have native platform stacks and writing a Rust binding to them is not often a great experience. And if you re-implement your own, that has its own trade-offs. But there's a lot of really cool things that have happened. Folks you should talk to if you haven't are the folks behind the Warp Terminal app, which a friend of mine who's actually one of the lead maintainers on Volta works on now full-time as his job. And it is not for me because of a couple opinionated choices it makes, and my muscle memory is too deep, but it's a really good thing, and it's Rust native, and it's very fast. And I commend people to go check it out because it's really good. And I like the experimentation in that space because Rust has some serious potential there.
I have to say, not only did we interview them, we also got some invite codes to pass out to the audience.
Sweet.
So, yeah,
that is excellent.
I'm way ahead of you there. And I actually use Warp as a daily driver for myself.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. They just cleared a hurdle, which means I'll probably go back and reevaluate it, which is they finally have fish support. And I've been a fish user for my shell for probably half a decade at this point. And there was just no way I was going to switch to something that didn't have fish integration native. But I do want to go back and try it again. They're doing great work.
Maybe you can help me to explain. I'm sure I'm not the only person who has this question. Like to me, like ZSH is already pretty good. So why should I look at fish? What is the benefit of fish? For me, I feel like fish is a little bit childish. Like that was the feeling I got when I looked at the fish homepage. I was like, is this like terminal for beginners?
Yeah, no, they were intentionally being a little goofy or silly with it, I think, just to be fun. The things I like most about fish are its completion system is much better than what you get out of the box in Z Shell. And it is, I don't use it as a scripting language much. In fact, the most shell scripting I've ever done was when I built the fish integration support for Volta back a few years ago. But little things like you start typing a word and Fish provides autocomplete for the last time you typed that and lets you. So I make heavy use of all the old Emacs shortcuts because macOS has them built in. And you can do word by word navigation or character by character navigation through the last thing you type. So if you type git, because you're going to do something with your git command line, and hit space, it's going to autocomplete the last git command you. And then if you want to cycle through the git commands you've done recently, you type git and then you hit Control P for previous, and you can just cycle through your previous commands like you would on most modern Bash or Z Shell implementations, but scoped down to the ones that start with that leading bit of your history. And then you can tab or Control E to tab through the next word or to jump to complete to the end, etc. Just a bunch of small niceties like that once I had played with them for a bit and gotten used to them, going back to Bash or Z Shell just felt kind of crippling. And a lot of the things that I used to use Oh My Z Shell for to customize my prompt, I found Fish gave me out of the box very nicely. These days I use Starship, the Rust prompt controller, which is great. It's all extra great because it is cross shell, but Fish gave me a lot out of the box that I never needed. There is an Oh My Fish, but I never installed it because I got everything I wanted right out of the box just with Fish itself. So it's not life-changing, but it just has a bunch of little niceties, especially around that kind of history navigation and completion. And Fish completions are really good in general.
Yeah, that's what I feel like. That's probably the power of Fish is the auto completion, because that's always what you see. That's in your face. Like you can tell somebody's using Fish when they're showing off the terminal, when you see like the shadow of upcoming commands coming up.
Yep, exactly.
So, okay. Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, why were we talking about terminals all of a sudden? Trying to think where we came from. Warp, yeah. Warp, and you're saying you're using...
Have you talked to JT and the folks behind New Shell?
No, that's somebody who I did want to talk to, though. I think they're working with Florian also, I think, or something.
And New is a very interesting project, and JT has deep, deep history with Rust. So totally an interesting person to talk to in general. And the work they're doing on New is very interesting. It's basically, what if we took some of the good ideas from PowerShell and gave it a more Unix-friendly interface? Because while there are many good ideas in PowerShell, I'm very happy to say that the syntax for PowerShell is terrible. I'm sorry. I like kebab case, but Pascal mixed with kebab case is just for typing, you're hitting the shift key constantly. I'm like, I don't want to do that when I'm typing in my shell. Don't make me do that. But the idea of passing around rich objects rather than just text streams in a structured way, really powerful. And I'm really excited to see it continuing to develop. Again, it's not yet my daily driver, but I've played with it. I have it installed. I use it occasionally. It's very good, especially when it combined with other good tools, stuff like JQ, which is not a Rust tool, XSV, which is a Rust tool. And of course, if you haven't talked to Burnt Sushi, that should be on your list because he's incredible.
Do you have any introductions you could do for us, for any of those people you mentioned?
Off the top of my head, I could probably put you in touch with JT. I haven't talked with him in a while, but we do correspond on Twitter. I have never actually chatted with Burnt Sushi, who, if listeners don't know, is the maintainer of Rust's regex crate and also of ripgrep, which is one of the very fastest grep style tools out there. If you're using VS Code, you're using ripgrep, whether you know it or not, every time you search for anything, because that's how its search engine is powered. But an unfortunate downside is that I just am not around that much anymore. I would like to be again someday, but I haven't been lately. So unfortunately, my connections are many fewer than they once were.
Just a general call out to the audience. If there's somebody you think that we should talk to, and especially if you can do the introduction, I'm more than happy to speak to nearly anybody. I think the only people who I maybe want to be interested in is maybe somebody who's never actually touched Rust and just want to talk about it or want to hear, I have a limit, right? But in general, I don't think I've said no to anybody in particular who came up and said, I really want to talk. I spend a lot of my time trying to find guests. And luckily, when I do get a reply, usually it's yes. I've gotten one rejection of no recently, but I tried to take it to heart. That's okay. It was more like they just weren't ready at the time, and this is fine. And sometimes I get, hey, English is not my first language, so I don't really feel comfortable to speak, and that's fine.
Yeah.
And sometimes I get to say, oh, why don't you talk to this guy who's on the team? Like, I'm the creator, but I don't feel comfortable. Can this guy talk? And that's fine for me, right? I just want to get you guys out there.
Yeah. No, do. And I'll tell people also, as someone who's done the podcasting thing and has interviewed guests, you don't have to be a super polished speaker. You don't have to have any experience doing it. Just show up and have a conversation. And usually that works pretty well. And good editors handle the rest. That's why we have good editors.
And also the surprising part as a podcaster who's basically always just doing interview episodes is that audience really, and I never could really figure this out, audience really love to hear that back and forth.
Yeah.
It's interesting. But a lot of stuff comes out, right? Because I heard feedback, hey, you guys got into a tangent about this Rust thing, and I never knew that. And then some people, they really love the technical parts too. Like for me, I usually listen to podcasts when I go to the gym. So if it's technical, I have to stop and listen because I cannot focus.
put the weights down and think about what they just said for a minute. Yeah.
And for some people can run the elliptical and do it at 3x or 5x or 2x speed at least. And I'm like, how the heck do you do that? I need to hear it.
No.
In fact, like I was freaking out one time because I was like, why are these guys talking so fast? And I looked, oh, I must have tapped the on accident and it went to 2x. And I was like, why was this episode so fast? And his voice seems a little bit higher for some weird reason, you know?
Yeah, no, I am similar. I actually can't do audiobooks at all because
Yeah.
I can't concentrate on them that way. I can do podcasts, but no, the conversational dynamic is, I think that's exactly right. And it's part of what makes podcasts fun is you're just hearing a couple of people, handful of people talk about something. And that can be, you know, when you get me on, then you end up with responses that are 4 paragraphs long. But in general, you just have a conversation that you're listening to. And people like conversations. Like that's the whole reason I got into podcasting in the first place is a friend of mine and I, we would have these conversations about tech and religion and ethics and art and life in general. And people would just sit and listen to us go back and forth. And sometimes we were agreeing and sometimes we were arguing, but people would just listen to us go back and forth. We noticed that dynamic over time. And we had the idea for the show eventually. But the thing that made us realize that it might actually be viable, that people might actually want to talk to us, is that people do that in real life. And that happens. If you have a couple interesting people or an interesting topic that I don't know how interesting I am or am not on my own, but Rust is an interesting topic. And so you get a couple people talking about it to other nerds who are interested in hearing about it. And boom, you've got something interesting and opportunity for people to learn.
Well, I think the more interesting part is when you hear different opinions about the same topic. This is why I think this, and then I disagree because of, and that's what I think I need to hear. So I guess I can say it directly. You'll probably hear it when this episode gets released. The previous one is I just talked to Andrew Kelly, who's the creator of Zig, right? And so I wanted to get him on the show because I want to hear, hey, Rust maybe not be for you, right? There's a big steep learning curve, right? And there's a lot of investment you need to do in order to get into it. Maybe Zig is a better fit for you. It's native compilation. And it's also there to fix the problems of C. So maybe Zig works better.
Yeah.
I don't know. You can take a look at it.
I really hope someday we get something that is a smaller language than Rust, because Rust is huge, but that nonetheless finds a way to do what Rust has often done in other areas and, quote, bend the curve, unquote, to really tackle the memory safety dynamic. Because that's the biggest thing. Like, I really admire a lot of the things I see about Zig, but I won't, having done Rust, give up the full end-to-end memory safety that we get in it. And I get the trade-offs being made there. But to me, that's just again, for me, that's a non-negotiable. I'm not willing to give it up anymore. And yet I see the attraction because something that is a smaller language could be really powerful. Without Boats had a great post a few years ago, Notes on a Smaller Rust, which I would commend to people, which tried to think about some of these dynamics. And I think it was pointed in a slightly different direction. But I would love to see, the big advantage that Zig has, the big advantage that Go has, the big advantage in the functional programming space that Elm has compared to much, much larger languages like Haskell is they're small. And they're relatively easy to learn end to end and know all the corners of them as languages. And that comes with trade-offs. Famously, like, this is how you do it. And that is very powerful in some ways. It's very much a downside in some ways. Go doesn't solve some of the problems Rust does and historically lacked some of the capabilities Rust had because of a lack of generics. They've tackled that latter problem. But you can also get your head around Go, at least the basics of Go, much faster than you can get your head around the basics of Rust. Mind, I think you fall off a cliff later. I think you're getting something for what you pay into Rust. I think it pays dividends back in a hurry. But I'd be really interested to, as excited as I am about Rust, I'm also very excited to see what Swift does, as it has a bunch of former Rust folks working on it, trying to solve some of the same kinds of problems. And I'm really excited for the next generation of languages that look at these things and say, and I mean, systems programming languages don't come along that often. It's probably going to be another 20 years, right? But I am really excited for the next round of this that says, okay, we see what Rust got right. It got a lot right. But no language is perfect. Well, can we do it smaller? Can we shave off some more of those rough edges? And Rust itself can do some of that with the addition system, but you can't do 100, like some things you can't do take backs on. So I hope we get some more experimentation in this space in the future, because I think there's a lot of opportunity here still.
Yeah, but the thing with Rust is there's never going to be a takeout necessarily. I mean, the interesting part about Rust is like, now that I'm thinking about it, it's a little bit sly how they do things because they say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, things should always compile. Well, how they get around
Mm-hmm.
that is using the addition, right?
Yep.
Okay, this is no longer valid.
Right.
But if you do compile it with this addition, then it's valid. So
It's
it's like,
fine.
okay, I see what you're doing.
Yep.
It's a little,
Yep.
you're not breaking the rules, but you're doing, it's slightly different
Yeah.
kind of thing.
It lets you make surface syntax changes. It doesn't let you make fundamental semantic changes to the language. And that's the really important distinction there. But that is a really valuable tool. It means we could do things like async await and change how that behaved. It means we can make small semantic changes on an addition boundary because you have control over when you opt into it. We can't make big ones. And we can't cut out whole chunks of the system where we think, we don't need that anymore. We can cut out small chunks. And I expect we'll see that over the life of it. And I think the addition idea is a brilliant innovation in the space because it lets us package up the changes we get over time into a coherent story. And it also lets us have things to focus on. And it lets us iterate the language without having to do it on 10-year cycles. Looking at you, C++.
I had to wait for the motor to stop.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah. So what was I going to say? Yeah. I agree. Like, it's not like I'm trying to say, okay, Russ, you're doing me dirty over here. You're breaking your rules. But
No.
My whole question was like, how can you evolve as a language and just keep adding and never having to remove something or never having to change something? Because like, hey, async keyword, right? What if other keywords come in? And then the good part is that they're thinking ahead, right? Okay.
Yep.
We can keep these guarantees and this is how we can do that. And I'm happy that they found a way to do it. Yeah. And as far as I know, nobody's upset about that. I think people are always forward looking for the most part.
Yeah. There's definitely in some more conservative computing software cultures a hesitancy about the 6-week release cycle. And I do think there may be value in some of the directions folks have explored in especially the Rust verification side of things about having here's a version of Rust that can get backported fixes for security, things like that, a sort of long-term support model and verified version of the compiler, especially if we want to see Rust go into spaces like automotives and space. We need that kind of thing. The addition cadence is long enough that I know one of the ideas being batted around a couple years ago, and I have not checked in the last probably 2 years, somewhere in there, was to sort of look and see, could we basically alternate on that sort of 3-year cadence that we have for additions of ship an addition and roughly 18 months later, so halfway through the addition cycle, target to have a verified version that is for that addition that then automotive could pick up, space could pick up, etc. And I think that's a really good idea and one that, again, I don't know what the status of that approach has been, but it's something that I think we need because in avionics, in automotive, in space, in these kinds of sectors, it is really important to have those kinds of guarantees. And the 6-week cycle is amazing. I love it. I loved doing the news episodes for Rustacean where every boom, 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 there's a new thing. And happily, that pace of change, I say happily because the language is maturing, it's slowed down, but it's not like the release notes for Rust 1.72 are going to be empty. There's going to be stuff happening there. And yet, for some of those chunks of the ecosystem where you need more stability than that, having a verified version, having a long-term support model, I think will be a really valuable thing for the language to find its way to.
Have you ever heard of Ferrocene?
Yep.
So that's basically what it's trying to do, but I think it's more on the commercial side. So we had an episode with them. I don't think it's released yet still.
Okay.
I think it's still being edited, but that one will be good because that one is...
Yeah.
So I guess I can happily say it because at the time of this recording, it's going to be out already.
Yeah.
But that one is...
I'll look forward to hearing that one.
It's Ada Core and Florian
Mm-hmm.
talking about Ferrocene, that they're working together on Ferrocene in some way. And they do talk about this, automotive and everything else, because Ada Core, I don't know how much you know about Ada, but it is built for that kind of like industry.
Yep. Now, I started my career in avionics, so I didn't write Ada in it, but I was adjacent to a lot of discussions around Ada, because while our code base was C for uninteresting reasons, a lot of folks I knew had worked on Ada code bases in the past. And actually, for all that Ada gets no real, it has no Hacker News cred in general. I'll put it that way. It's not on the hype train. It's a very interesting language in some of the things it's done. And there aren't really any other mainstream languages, maybe besides Rust, that have tackled some of the problems that Ada tackled 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So very interesting overlap there in the problem domain.
Well, I think the big difference is that not everybody needs that safety
Yep.
and that proof and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's
Yep.
not useful in your life, but it's just
Right.
like for your work, most likely you're not going to have to use this.
Correct.
So it
It's
just
like,
doesn't make
look,
sense.
if you're writing a TLS implementation, you should be using the best type system on the planet. If you're writing a CRUD web app, like, I mean, I'm a big fan of type systems, but I don't think your CRUD web app is guaranteed to fail because it's not written in Rust or Haskell, right? It's just not. You don't need that. But if you're writing a TLS implementation, please use every tool you can to get it right, because it really, 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 really matters. Use Rust, use of formal verification methods. I mean, write it Idris or FStar or something where you've got dependently typed language on your side that you can literally prove the correctness of it, right? There are different cases. And similarly, automotive, medical devices, all these kinds of things, like proving correctness matters a lot more than it does on your average web app. So I'm really happy to hear that that's continuing, and I will look forward to that episode, listening to it.
Why can't TLS be in that same industry? I mean, if you think about it, if something doesn't work properly or whatever, an exploit happens, that's still very dangerous. So I don't see why
That's
TLS.
exactly what I mean. Is it should be in that bucket. And your average CRUD app, on the other hand, of like, serving some little web app, it's not as big of a deal. It's the TLS implementation that secures it is a really big deal. And obviously, if you're not securing your database and all of those kinds of things, it's a big deal. And I do think there's an advantage in the Rust world of being able to say, hey, I actually can get a lot of the productivity benefits people find in more dynamic languages while also having this really great performance, while also really having this really great type system. And I mean, that's why Rust is still my favorite programming language. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on this show. People at work hear me say that all the time. It's true. It's still my favorite.
So are you the guy in the office that always talks about a specific programming language and people tell you to quiet down, or they just avoid talking to you?
Oh, I just talk about programming languages, period, and they tell me to quiet down because I'm that guy. But mostly I keep it in these days. Mostly.
Yeah. Well, I know it's late for you, and we can go on and on forever, right? I think the main point is people miss you.
Yes.
They want to know what you're up to. So you're busy with, you're still sticking with Rust. You're still taking a look at everything going on, but you're just not doing the podcast for the time being.
Yep.
You may be getting podcasting at some point, sometime in the future, but at the current moment, you're kind of here. You're kind of working on your daily life, right?
That's about right.
I think
Yep.
that's commendable, right? Yeah, I mean, is there anything else you want people to let people know what you're up to, or maybe how they can catch you, or anything you plan to do in the future? I mean, do you plan to come do another talk at Rust Belt or anything else?
I might. There's interesting points of overlap with some of the stuff I've been working on and kind of researching even at work. So definitely open to that possibility. You can always find anything going on with me at my website, chriskrycho.com. It helps that my name is literally a globally unique identifier. There are no other Chris Krychos on the planet. So if you find a Chris Krycho and it's not me, you should email me because I want to know about it. But in general, everything's at chriskrycho.com. That includes upcoming talks. When this episode is out, I'll have a link from my website to the show saying, hey, go listen to this. I was there. I'll be giving a talk at EmberConf about TypeScript. I'll probably be pitching at least one talk later this year. I was going to give a talk in Poland about types and type systems, and then some things happened. And so, I'm praying for people in Ukraine and the many good folks in Poland and other surrounding countries who've been helping out with the refugee situation there, et cetera. But I'm obviously not going to Poland to give that talk now. But I do try to give a couple talks every year, and Rust is definitely one of the things I would like to come give talks about again in the future. So keep your eyes open. Maybe again someday.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else before we kind of sign off? I feel like maybe you gave a really good kind of up to speed about what you're up to and how we can catch what's going on with you.
No, other than just to say thank you so much for having me on and taking the time. I really enjoyed chatting with you. So I appreciate it.
I'm happy that you were able to come on, and I apologize if I bugged you at your work email, but that was the only email I could find.
It's all good. No, GitHub. We have
Yeah.
policies.
That's what I think was where I got it from.
Yeah,
So
no, it totally makes sense. But yep,
part of the issue of finding guests is like you have to scour the internet for like people's contact, and even if you get it, it may actually end up in their spam or whatever.
it's true.
So it's tricky.
It's true. For reference, anyone who wants to reach out, my email is hello@chriskrycho.com. There's also a contact form on my website, which is technically about speaking opportunities. But if you send me something from there that isn't about speaking opportunities, I'll still email you back. And I respond to every email I get. So feel free to email me. I'd be happy to hear from folks.
I think you said you get about 1 to 2 a month about your podcast. So I guess it's manageable right now.
Yep. It's not so bad now.
I think maybe I can create a lorem ipsum generator for us and then keep you busy.
I like it.
Okay. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank
I
you.
hope that, in the future you do pick it back up, but, let's see what happens. Doesn't sound likely, but I can have hopes and dreams, and so does everybody else.
Indeed.
All right. Thanks again for your time, and maybe we'll have you coming back to talk about who knows what's up. Maybe someday you'll say, we finally pulled the plug and we're all into Rust and WebAssembly and LinkedIn.
You know what? If that ever happens, I will definitely tell you.
Yeah, please let me know. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.